بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك، عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى يوم الدين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، ذلك ومن يعظم شعائر الله فإنها من تقوى القلوب. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an honor to be amongst you on this day, the day of Arba'een of Aba Abdullah. We have gathered in this majlis, in this far corner of the world, far away from Imam Hussein and the city of Karbala. And there are millions and millions of people who have gathered and made that pilgrimage towards Imam Hussein. Inshallah, we ask Allah to make us as well amongst those pilgrims, amongst those zawar of Aba Abdullah, if not in this year, but in the next year, inshallah. And we want to as well reflect on this moment. It is a moment in which, again, millions of people walk and gather towards the haram of Imam Hussein. It is an event that, it's become somewhat famous throughout the world. And it is one thing that, in fact, defines the school of the Ahlul Bayt. This process and this act of going on a pilgrimage towards the Ahlul Bayt. It's become one of the sha'air, one of the signposts of the Ahlul Bayt, of the school of the Ahlul Bayt. So I want to take these next few moments that we have, this tonight and the following majlis, to think about this process. What is it that we are doing when we are doing ziyarah to Imam Hussein? What does it mean when we engage in this journey towards Aba Abdullah? And why do we engage in it? And we see that the ziyarah of Imam Hussein is not unique in Islam. In fact, we have other types of pilgrimages in Islam. And not just that, we have other things that are called sha'air in Islam. This ayah of Surah Al-Hajj, Allah says, ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. This ayah 32 of Surah Al-Hajj. Allah says that is, and whoever magnifies and honors and glorifies the sha'air of Allah, that is from taqwa al-qulub, that is from the piety of the hearts. And so we have other sha'air in Islam. One of those sha'air, one of those signposts, those markers for Islam is the pilgrimage towards Hajj. This is another pilgrimage that every single Muslim must undertake. And so we have to think about what are these rituals that we engage in. Sometimes our heart yearns for getting closer to Aba Abdullah. Or we are mustati and we are able to, and we engage and we undertake the Hajj pilgrimage. But we must take a moment to reflect, now that we are unfortunately not able to in this year, to undertake that ziyarah, then we can maybe prepare ourselves. Once we have this deeper understanding, we can prepare ourselves for that process, for that journey. And so maybe inshallah, with Allah's guidance, we can undertake that ziyarah towards Imam Hussein in a following year. If not in Arba'een, at another time. Once we understand and we have a deeper insight into this ritual, into this journey, then we can make that preparation. We can prepare our bodies, our souls, our hearts, and our finances to undertake that journey. But that is not all. The sha'a'ir of Allah, the sha'a'ir, the signposts, those markers of Allah, and as well the markers of the school of the Ahlul Bayt are sanctified by Allah Himself, such that anyone who dishonors these markers, these sha'a'ir, has dishonored Allah Himself. And so the sha'a'ir become of the highest principles and ideals within Islam. If someone wants to dishonor Islam, then they will, na'udhu billah, dishonor those markers that point people towards Islam. And so, Hajj, as one of those markers, those sha'a'ir of Allah, becomes not just something that we must prepare ourselves for, but it becomes a marker for Islam itself. If we want to understand Islam and the teachings of Islam, the principles that Islam is teaching us, then we must as well, we can use these sha'a'ir as metaphors, as symbols for the teachings of Islam. So when we think about the ziyarah towards Imam Hussein, we really at the same time are thinking and reflecting upon the teachings of the school of the Ahlul Bayt, because they are not separate. We have from not just the Ahlul Bayt, the Imams who come after Imam Hussein, not just Imam Zainul Abidin and beyond. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. But we have teachings from the Imams prior to Imam Hussein, telling us about the importance of crying for and lamenting, remembering and visiting Aba Abdullah. And so it becomes one of the central points, the central teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, from the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad al-Mustafa, until Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, until the rest of the Ahlul Bayt. If we want to understand, get a deeper insight into Islam and what Islam teaches us, then we can take this opportunity to understand the sha'a'ir of Aba Abdullah. We can understand the ziyarah of Aba Abdullah. And we can use this as a means and as a gateway for us to understand the teachings of Islam. Now, we talk about sha'a'ir. We talk about this pilgrimage towards Aba Abdullah. When we think about it, whenever we do a ritual, whenever we do a form of ibadah, on the very basic level, we are talking about rectifying and orienting our hearts towards something. Orienting our hearts and our bodies and our souls towards that action. And so when we look in this ayah of Surah Al-Hajj, Allah talks about taqwa al-qulub. ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. We're thinking about and we're looking at the very essence of who we are as human beings. And that is located in the heart. When we think about our essence, when we think about ourselves as human beings, we're not just one-dimensional beings. Allah has created us with an intellect. He has created us with emotions, And He has created us in terms of a soul that is now attempting to direct itself back to Allah. And He has created us in a life with a particular story, with a narrative that defines our entire lives. Sometimes we think of this life that we lead, these 60, 70 years, as simply being a terrestrial, material, physical life that we are living. And so sometimes we think that once we live this life, we might live a good physical, material, financial life, and that's it. That's our ultimate goal. But then Allah says, look at these individuals throughout human history, not different beings, not angels, but human beings who, because of their devotion, because of that orientation towards Allah, sincerity towards Allah, Allah has made their actions as examples for all of humankind. And so when we think about the pilgrimage towards Hajj, the Hajj pilgrimage, the Hajj that we are all required to undertake, this begins, Allah cites the actions of Nabi Ibrahim and his family. And Allah takes this example, an example that if we were to look at those actions, we look at the actions of Lady Hajar, we look at the actions of Nabi Ismail and Nabi Ibrahim. If we were at that time, we were to look at this woman walking back and forth between these two hills, we might think of them as simply a mother trying to sustain her child. We might think of them in terms of the physical reality. But then Allah says, because of the heart of this person, the orientation that this person has, the sincerity that I see, that Allah Himself attests to in the actions of this person, Allah sets this person's actions as an example that other people now must come and imitate. And so Allah creates and establishes His religion based on the actions of a mother towards her child. That's love. And this going back and forth between these two hills. Allah doesn't see our actions in terms of simply the physical. He doesn't see them simply in terms of a natural love, an emotion between a mother and a child. Allah sees the spiritual underlying reality of those actions. And that's why Allah sets this example, sets this life aside. And He says that we must imitate and emulate the actions of this person. And that becomes the pilgrimage towards Hajj. And so sometimes there are certain actions that Allah sets apart, and He sets them as the pillars of His religion. Some things that we might not be able to have insight into. But then through the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, we can begin to uncover that superficial aspect and understand what is it that Allah sees in this person and in the sacrifice that this person makes. So, if we want to think about what is it that has made the Hajj, has made this one sha'ira, this one signpost of Allah, endure throughout history. And on the other hand, we want to understand what is it that makes the ziyarah of Imam Hussein last and in fact grow throughout time. Doesn't just begin. We sometimes think that Imam Hussein came to Karbala and then he sacrificed his life, he sacrificed his family. And if we were to think about it simply in terms of the historical, we might think that this is just another event in Islamic history that has come and has passed us by. But then we see that Allah sets this example aside and He makes it grow. makes the hearts of people grow. And the more we continue throughout time, and the more the Shia of the Ahlul Bayt, in fact, the more the Muslims and anyone who understands the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, whether they're Muslim or not, the more they come and understand the journey of Imam Hussein, the more they yearn towards Karbala. And so it's not defined or limited towards a certain time. The ziyarah of Imam Hussein is not limited to a particular time, nor a particular place. But in fact, it extends beyond time and space, beyond a particular identity, whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. It strikes at a very essential part of our very being. And this is one of the things that the Ahlul Bayt points to. They want to tell us that if you want to understand one of the essential elements that Allah points to in what He decides to make a sha'ira, a marker for His religion, you have to think about it in terms of who you are as a human being. These sha'air, they are aligned with our very nature, with the nature that Allah has created us upon. And so whenever we hear, whether we are Muslim or non-Muslim, whenever we hear about the story of Abu Abdullah, our hearts and our souls are automatically attracted. They're instantly drawn towards Abu Abdullah. When we think about our hearts, I said this ayah of Surah Al-Hajj, Allah speaks about the heart. He says, ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. There's a distinct connection between upholding the sha'air of Allah, those signposts and those markers of Allah, and the taqwa of the heart. This taqwa al-qulub, this piety that sits in the very soul and in the very essence of a human being. And so if we want to think about the sha'air of the Ahlul Bayt as well, they also align with that very essence of a human being. When we think about what we do in these majalis, we cry for Abu Abdullah. This, I'll just take a moment here and reflect on this process of crying. When we think about our hearts, Allah tells us that there are moments throughout our lives, because of our actions, because of the deeds that we have done, our intentions, and so on, the culture and the customs that we have surrounded ourselves with, there are moments in which our hearts become hardened. ثُمَّ قَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ. There are people whose hearts are so hardened that whatever prophet, whatever messenger that Allah sends to these people, their hearts are so hardened that that revelation that Allah has sent, that light and that illumination that Allah sends through His prophets, it does not seep into their hearts because of their actions. There are people, and we see this throughout prophetic history, that there are people who Allah sends Nabi Musa to. And these people, Bani Israel, they reject the prophet. And not only this, it is said that the Bani Israel would kill one after another 70 of the prophets that Allah sent to them. If we want to think about how hard a heart can become, how much stone-like a heart can become, it's not just to reject a message, but it is to say that anyone who gives this message their blood will be spilled. That's the extent that Allah tells us that a people can fall to, such that their hearts have become so hardened that not only does the message of Allah not reach their ears and reach their hearts, but Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. But then Allah says, in this very same ayah, Allah says, ثُمَّ قَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُم مِّن بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ فَهِيَ كَالْحِجَارَةِ أَوْ أَشَدُّ قَسْوَةً. Their hearts become so hardened that they become like rocks, like stones, or even worse, or even more solidified. But then Allah never loses hope. He says, وَإِن مِّنْهَا لَمَا يَهْبِطُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ. But then these very hearts can be opened. These very hearts can be softened. And Allah says they become so soft that Allah can allow springs to gush forth from these hearts. One of the beauties of these majalis, one of the beauties of the remembrance of Aba Abdullah is this very process of crying and shedding tears for Aba Abdullah. This softening our hearts through the memory of Imam Hussein. We said that one of the dimensions, one of the aspects of the sha'a'ir of Allah is that it aligns with our very soul, with that nature that Allah has created us upon. And so when we think about what we do in these gatherings, we shouldn't take it lightly. And in fact, in the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, we are told that this very process of crying is in and of itself a sacred process. It's an honorable and an honored process, such that there is a hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, in which the Imam says, وَمَنْ ذُكِرَ الْحُسَيْنُ عِنْدَهُ فَخَرَجَ مِنْ عَيْنِهِ مِنَ الدُّمُوعِ مِقْدَارَ جَنَاحِ ذُبَابٍ كَانَ ثَوَابُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ وَلَمْ يَرْضَى لَهُ بِدُونِ الْجَنَّةِ. The Imam tells us that if a person were to be in such a state that their heart is so softened, their heart is so soft and receptive towards the message of Aba Abdullah, remembers the sacrifice of Aba Abdullah, such that when Aba Abdullah's name is mentioned in his presence, this person begins to shed tears. And not sometimes our hearts are so softened and so in such memory of Imam Hussein, those, maybe you have witnessed this, that a person hears the name of Imam Hussein and they can't help but gush tears from their eyes. There are some people who are like this. And maybe we have met them and maybe we have been in their company. But the Imam doesn't say that this is the standard. He says that if a person were to remember or were to be told about Imam Hussein, and a drop of tear so small as by the size of the wing of a fly, imagine how small that might be. If this amount of tear were to fall from this person's eyes, then Allah will hold himself responsible to give this person his reward. His reward is going to be upon the shoulders of Allah. And he is not going to satisfy himself, Allah is not going to satisfy himself with anything less than paradise itself. This is that emotional state, that emotional connection that we must have when we think about Aba Abdullah. On the one hand, we are thinking about this connection towards Aba Abdullah from a very basic emotional state. When we think about the sacrifice of Aba Abdullah, he sacrificed his entire family. He sacrificed those who were most beloved to him. And so when we think about this, where we hear this, our hearts must move. We must shed tears. But we said that the human being is not a one-dimensional person. It's not a one-dimensional creature. Beyond this, beyond the emotional connection, we must also have an intellectual connection. And it is through the combination of our intellect and our emotions that we get to the heart. In fact, the qalb, according to the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, is not simply this idea that we have in our culture. Our heart is the source, we think, of emotion, and our brain or our minds is the source of the intellect. Rather, what the Ahlul Bayt tell us is that our heart is the source of both our emotions and our intellect. When our intellect is moved, our heart and our soul must be moved as well. And so when we think about our connection to Aba Abdullah, it must not simply be an emotional connection. That is why, according to the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, a person must do ziyarah and must remember and visit Imam Hussein knowing the status of the Imam. It's not simply for me to come and connect with another human being. Sometimes when I see someone within my family, they are suffering. Sometimes I might have a deeper emotional connection with that person because I have grown up with them, because they are someone who has maybe taken care of me. If I see my mother suffering through an illness, na'udhu billah, may this not happen to any one of you, but imagine someone beloved in your life, one of your family members, is suffering from a terrible illness. Automatically you have this emotional attachment and this emotional response. This is on one level. We as human beings are connected through our emotions with those who we are surrounded with. But the Ahlul Bayt tell us that our connection to Aba Abdullah should not simply be a matter of emotions. It should be also a matter of our intellect. We should know the status and the honor that Allah has placed for Aba Abdullah. And so in another hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, alayhi salam, the Imam tells us, this is in fact a hadith of our seventh Imam, Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam, in which he says, Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. He says, أدنى ما يثاب به زائر الحسين بشاطئ الفرات إذا عرف حقه وحرمته وولايته أن يغفر له ما تقدم من ذنبه وما تأخر. The least amount of reward that Allah will give to a person who does a visitation, is a pilgrim towards Aba Abdullah by the Euphrates, by the banks of the Euphrates. If that person knows the haqq of Imam Hussein, the right and the status of Imam Hussein, wa hurmatah, and the sanctity of Imam Hussein, wa wilayatah, and knows the wilaya, that authority that Imam Hussein has upon all of us, human beings, whether you are Muslim or not, that wilaya that Imam Hussein has upon all human beings. If a person with this understanding does a visitation towards Imam Hussein, the least amount of reward that Allah will give to this person is that He will forgive all of this person's sins, those sins that he has done in the past, and any of those sins that he will do in the future. This hadith, the Imam is telling us that we know you grow and you are sustained by these tears. You grow and you are sustained by this emotional connection that you have towards Aba Abdullah. As a school of the Ahlul Bayt, we raise our children with these memories, with these stories of Imam Hussein. But the Imam tells us that this should not be your ultimate aspiration. It should not be simply an emotional connection. It should also be an intellectual connection. A connection where you understand the rank and the status of Imam Hussein. And you can distinguish and decipher the sacrifice of Imam Hussein based on that rank. If it were any of the other companions of the Prophet of Islam, we would not be so moved and we should not be so hurt as we are by the sacrifice of Imam Hussein. There is no one in the history of mankind who should be at the same level as that direct connection to Allah Himself. And it is this is the reason why when you look in the books of ziyarah, when you look in those different ziyarat that the Ahlul Bayt teach us, they don't teach us simply in terms of the relationship between Imam Hussein and his sacrifice of his son Aliyun al-Akbar. Or, for example, his sacrifice of Abdullah al-Asghar. They don't teach us simply in terms of those individuals that Imam Hussein saw being killed in front of his eyes. That's not what they point to. The ziyarah of Ashura. What do we talk about? We talk about the rank of Imam Hussein in relation to Allah. That's ma'rifah of Imam Hussein comes from understanding his rank. Understanding that Imam Hussein was carrying along and carrying through that same memory and that same hidayah that the Prophet himself brought. And so he was that same linkage towards that hidayah and that guidance that Rasulullah had brought us. And if we understand our connection, we reform our connection and reorient ourselves and our memory of Imam Hussein in terms of that hidayah, in terms of that guidance that Rasulullah brought, then we can get a better understanding, first of all, of the mission of Imam Hussein, but we can also at the same time get a better insight into why we must continue this memory. The memory of Imam Hussein is not simply the memory of the grandson of the Rasulullah. It is the memory of Rasulullah himself. It's the memory of Rasulullah himself. When we look in history, we think about what was Imam Hussein struggling and striving for. We see that there was a systematic attempt to make the Muslim Ummah forget about the memory of Rasulullah, to change the religion of Islam, to change those values and those ideals that the Muslims had in mind. And so when we think about the ma'rifah of Imam Hussein, we think about it, the maqam of Imam Hussein, we think about his relation to Rasulullah and his continuing of that same legacy. This is on our level, on the level of the human soul. But we are told by the Ahlul Bayt as well that this ziyarah, that enduring force of this ziyarah is not simply limited towards human beings. When we want to think about what is it that makes this ziyarah of Imam Hussein endure throughout time and space, it is on one level because it aligns with our soul, with our very existence as human beings. But then the Ahlul Bayt tell us that this ziyarah of Imam Hussein is not simply limited or confined towards human beings. It is also something that all of Allah's creation engages in. We want to think about what is it that makes one of the sha'a'ir of Allah endure. We think about it in terms of how those sha'a'ir align with Allah's creation, with the nature that Allah has created around us. Sometimes we think of ourselves as human beings as separate from the rest of Allah's creation. Sometimes we think that we are one existence, we have one being, we are human beings, we create our societies, we live our lives, and then the rest of Allah's creation can live its own life. We are separate. Sometimes we're even worse. We think of ourselves as dominating over the creation of Allah. And so we think about ourselves as overpowering that very creation. We can do with Allah's nature as we will, because we are at the head of Allah's creation. We can do with it whatever we want. We can destroy it, lay waste to Allah's nature, lay waste to the entire earth. Nothing will happen. We will live our lives and we will benefit and we will continue. But Allah tells us that if you want to succeed and endure as a race, as a human being, then you must align yourself not only with your own soul, but you must bring yourself in alignment with the rest of my creation. And so we see that one of the elements of this sha'a'ir of Imam Hussein, one of the elements that makes the memory of Imam Hussein and this remembrance of Imam Hussein endure is that the Ahlul Bayt tell us that the very creation of Allah itself remembers Imam Hussein and weeps for the Imam. There are various ahadith. One of those ahadith is a hadith in which Amirul Mu'mineen Imam Ali alayhi salam tells us, Imam Ali, again, before the events of Karbala, he tells us that I see a time in which this son of mine, Hussein, is going to be killed and his body is going to be laid in this land behind the city of Kufa. Think about the city of Kufa, that city that forgot and was willing to forget about Imam Hussein. And so Imam Ali is telling the inhabitants of this city that my son is going to be killed in the proximity and in the neighborhood of your very city. And I see a time in which even the wild animals will come and extend their necks, and they will weep for my son Hussein. Even these very creatures that you might not be able to understand their actions, they will come and weep for my son. And in another hadith, the Imam tells us that even the heavens and the earth will weep for Hussein. The heavens and the earth will come and they will weep for Abu Abdullah. We are aligning ourselves when we gather in these majalis. When we go and visit Abu Abdullah, we are aligning ourselves with the creation of Allah. We are saying that we are not separate from this creation. Oh Allah, we understand that this action against Imam Hussein was not simply an action against an individual human being. It was not simply confined to history. It was an action against you, O Allah, and against the very fabric of your creation. It tore the fabric of the very physical and the natural world. And so the Ahlul Bayt tell us that even the very heavens and the earth will weep for Imam Hussein. But beyond that, it is said, according to another hadith of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, that Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, that the Imam tells his followers, what is wrong with you? Why do you not go and visit my grandfather Hussein? Why do you not go and visit his grave? Why do you not remember him? Because if you were only to see what I see, the Imam tells us that 4,000 angels of Allah come and visit Imam Hussein. Come and gather around the grave of Imam Hussein and weep for that Imam. We think about the relationship between the angels of Allah and Allah Himself. These angels, whenever the Ahlul Bayt or the Quran speaks about angels, these are the direct connection between Allah's creation on our level, on the physical and the material world, with the higher spiritual realms. And so whenever Allah wants to communicate with human beings, whenever Allah wants to enact one of His divine commandments or His divine will, He sends an angel to enact and to enforce that divine command. When He wants to destroy a people, He sends angels to destroy that people. Whenever He wants to bless a people, He sends angels to bring those blessings. Whenever Allah wants to speak to humankind, He sends those angels towards the humankind. Angels are this very connection between the spiritual creation of Allah and this physical world. And so Allah tells us, through the words of the Ahlul Bayt, The Ahlul Bayt tell us that the angels of Allah themselves, the spiritual realm, the highest possible realm of Allah's creation, they as well come and descend upon the grave of Aba Abdullah. We want to align ourselves. We want to think about what are the different elements that make these pilgrimages, these rites and these rituals of Allah endure throughout time and space. We think about them in terms of how they align, not just with our soul, not just with our existence as human beings, how they align with the creation of Allah in this physical world, but as well with how they align with the higher spiritual realms that Allah has created. And so we see that at every single level, there is this remembrance and this legacy and this memory of Aba Abdullah, this crying and shedding tears for Aba Abdullah, this visiting of the grave of Aba Abdullah. And so if we as human beings want to align ourselves, then we must as well shed tears and remember Aba Abdullah. We cannot confine Aba Abdullah to a particular time and to a particular place, nor can we confine it to one intention or to one direction or another. The mission of Aba Abdullah aligns itself with the rest of Allah's creation as well. And so we see that whatever time and place, they reflect upon one dimension of Aba Abdullah's journey. And so we as well, in this moment, we reflect upon those days in which the first visitor towards Aba Abdullah came. We said the angels of Allah descend themselves, come down towards the grave of Aba Abdullah. But there was a person, there was a companion of the Prophet of Islam, and he was the one who begins this ritual of Arba'in, journeying towards the grave of Imam Hussein and his companions. It is said that Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, he was the one who came towards the grave, the first one to visit Aba Abdullah. It is said that he came and he was an old man. He couldn't make this journey on his own. And so he took one of his servants and they came together towards the grave of Imam Hussein. They began their journey towards Imam Hussein by the banks of the Euphrates. They made their ritual ablutions. They made their bodies and their clothes pure for them to get close towards the grave of Imam Hussein. They did their ghusl by the banks of the Euphrates. And it is said that Jabir would take one step after another towards the grave of Imam Hussein, until it is said that finally when he gets close to that grave, it is said that when he hears that this is the grave, this is the resting place of your Hussein, it is said that Jabir casts his body, he falls upon that grave. He cannot control himself anymore. He says, Wa Husseina, Wa Aba Abdullah. It is said that Jabir would cry and he would cry and he would shed tears for that memory that he had of Hussein. He would see Hussein on the shoulder of Rasulullah. He remembered Rasulullah kissing the body of Hussein, and now he sees the body of Hussein under the ground and he cast his body upon that grave. And yet we can say, maybe in our hearts, we can say to Jabir, oh Jabir, you did not see what Zainab saw, and yet this is how you behave. You do not see what Zainab saw, and yet you cannot control yourself and you cast your body upon the grave of Hussein. What would you do, O Jabir, if you were Zainab? What would you do, O Jabir? If you were the sister of Hussein and you were to see the enemy soldiers surrounding Hussein, if you were to hear the call of Hussein, Hal min nasirin yansurani. Hussein had given all of his brothers and all of his nephews and all of his sons in the path of Allah. He had given all of his companions, and he had seen each one of them being struck down one after another. and this heart of Hussein cannot bear it any longer. We would say to Jabir, "Oh Jabir, what would you do if you were Zainab and you saw those enemy soldiers now circling around the body of Hussein after he had fallen to the ground? What would you do, oh Jabir, after you had seen the body of Hussein being trampled under the hooves of the enemy soldiers, after you had seen the head of Hussein being carried throughout the cities of Sham and Iraq? What would you do, oh Jabir, if you were to see the children and Imam Sajjad being shackled and taken as prisoners throughout these cities? What would you do, oh Jabir, if you were to see these children being cast into those dungeons of Ibn Ziyad and Yazid, being beaten by those enemy soldiers? وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. مات بحسين.
يا حسين 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 یا حسین یا حسین سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا کچھ بیبیاں یہاں ہے تو کچھ بیبیاں وہاں کرتی ہوئی فغاں کرتی ہوئی فغاں بکھری ہوئی تھی مقتل سرور میں جا بجا سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا ایک بی بی دشت خونی میں جاتی ہے نہر پر کہتی بچشم تر کہتی بچشم تر عباس دینے آئی ہوں پرسا سکینہ کا سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب بیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا گھٹ گھٹ کے لاڈلی تیری زندان میں مر گئی تربت وہیں بنی تربت وہیں بنی بھیا وہ قید سے نہ ہوئی مر کے بھی جدا سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو بلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا اکبر کی قبر پر ہوئی لیلا یوں نوح گر دیکھا نہ سال بھر دیکھا نہ سال بھر
آئی ہوں قید شام سے اب ہو کہ میں رہا سادات سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئی وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا بانو یہ بین کرتی تھی اے میرے بے زباں ماں ڈھونڈے اب کہاں ماں ڈھونڈے اب کہاں بتلا دے ہے کہاں میرا اصغر کربلا سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا قربان تیرے اے میرے ماں جائے بے وطن مجبور تھی بہن مجبور تھی بہن زندہ میں مجھ سے تیری امانت ہوئی جدا سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا چہلم کو کربلا میں جب آئیں وہ بیبیاں سادات کربلا سادات کربلا یا حسین 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 یا حسین
زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی بعد تیرے ایسا لوٹا گھر بعد تیرے ایسا لوٹا گھر سر پہ نہ چھوڑی ایک کے چادر سر پہ نہ چھوڑی ایک کے چادر کھینچ لیا بیمار کا بستر دیتی رہی میں دہائی زینب لوٹ آئی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے جڑ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی تاریکی رستے انجانے دشمن ہر سو نیزے تانے 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 کرب و بلا کے بر میں نہ جانے کیسی شام تھی آئی زینب آ گئی بھائی زینب آ گئی بھائی لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، حسرت تو تھی جانے خواہ ہے،
حسرت تو تھی جانے خواہر،
دیتے اجازت گئے یہ ستم گئے،
دیتے اجازت کر یہ ستم گر،
میت پر کچھ دیر ٹھہر کر میت پر کچھ دیر ٹھہر کر رو لیتی ماں جائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، دو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، چلتے چلتے شام جو پہنچے،
چلتے شام جو پہنچے،
کچھ مت پوچھو بھیا ہم سے،
کچھ مت پوچھو بھیا ہم سے،
موت تھی بہتر اس جینے سے، موت مگر نہ آئی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، لو زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، ہائے میرا بیمار بھتیجا،
ہائے میرا بیمار بھتیجا،
پل پل خون کے آنسو رویا،
پل پل خون کے آنسو رویا،
کیا کرتی مجبور تھی بھیا، کچھ نہ بہر کر پائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، لو زندان سے خام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، غم سے پھٹا جاتا ہے کلیجا،
ہم سے پھٹا جاتا ہے کلیجا،
جاگو برادر اٹھو بھیا،
جاگو برادر اٹھو بھیا،
لے لو اس لاچار کا پرسا، شام جسے چھوڑائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، او زندان شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، شام سے چھٹ کر زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، درد کا پے کر غم کی زباں ہوں،
درد کا پے کر غم کی زباں ہوں،
ایک تصویر آہ فغاں ہوں،
ایک تصویر آہ فغاں ہوں،
پشت پہ میرے دروں کے نشاں ہو، آج دکھانے آئی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، زینب آ گئی بھائی، دو زندان شام سے چھٹ گئے، یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین
حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، قتيل العبرة حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين قتيل العبرة حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، حبيب الخالي حسين عشق دلالي، حسين منو لي غيره، حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، طبيب جروحي حسين سكنت بروحي، حسين عشت بالذكرى، حسين عشت بالذكرى، حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين عزيز الزهرة، حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا، ايش كثر لاموني حسين يا نور عيوني حسين محبتك جمرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
عشق وجداني حسين جرب شرياني حسين جرب كل قطرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
يا نور عيوني حسين تظل محبوبي حسين وهب لك عمره وهب لك عمره حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا حسين
يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
فريتك عمري حسين وهبتك نحري حسين وهب لك عمره حسين وهب لك عمره حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين عزيز الزهرة حسين حسين يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا حسين
يا مولا يا مولا يا مولا
صلوات.
Please prepare for Salat. We'll do Ziyarat afterwards. So, good job. Mohsen, can you get Sajda for me and Dani? Okay.
Can you please announce that if they need masks, there are some extra masks right next to the turban. They should have it on.
Quick announcement, everyone. Masks are mandatory inside. If you're not wearing one, there's some disposable masks available at the entrance. So there are quite a few people here, so we want to make sure everyone is safe and secure. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما صل على محمد الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله